First up, auction clearance rates. What did we see in this sort of second big weekend?
Second weekend, market's up and running. Volumes are higher, of course. And I think sellers would be feeling a little better about themselves, particularly in the Sydney market. I think the market's just starting to take shape now. Of course, we will get more listings coming through and a better insight into those underlying dynamics. But Sydney auction clearance rates up by nearly 10% at the weekend, 67% clearance rate. Melbourne over 70% for the first time this year, back to where it was for most of last year. So it's still looking like evolving into a seller's market, I believe. Certainly well below where it was a year ago. Of course, we had over 80% a year ago in Sydney and in the high 70s in Melbourne. Brisbane up again on the weekend as well, so some winners all around.
Yeah, let's just look at the auction clearance rates now from the weekend as a whole.
Yep.
City by city. What did we see?
Well, as I said, Sydney up nearly 10% on the weekend. I think it was interesting that if we look closer at the Sydney results, we can see that it was the higher proportion of inner suburban listings that were part of the story for a higher clearance rate. Of course, we will see a higher proportion of inner city or inner suburban higher priced properties as the season progresses. Yeah,
we're looking at the auction listings for this year so far versus the same time last year at the moment. What can we draw from that?
Well, look, that's the interesting thing as well, Sophie, and perhaps there's something to do with that we have fewer choices out there for sellers or for buyers at the market. Even though auction clearance rates were up in Sydney by 10% last weekend, listing numbers are well down. In fact, this coming weekend there'll be a similar amount of properties offered for auction as last weekend. So well down auction listing numbers. Of course, they were near record levels a year ago. And Melbourne's the only capital city market that's tracking ahead of where it was a year ago, if we look at the last 2 weeks and compare them to the first 2 weeks of the season.
Yeah, and now we're having a look at Melbourne, where the auction results were over the weekend. Where did we see the most action in Melbourne?
Well, look, it's really, I guess, same old situation in Melbourne. We saw that those outer suburban, lower price suburbs had the highest clearance rates. In fact, the Melbourne auction market, the Melbourne housing market, has been remarkably consistent over the last year. Most areas have recorded clearance rates in the 70s and in the 80s. We saw that technique starting to emerge again last weekend, that trend where most regions had 70% clearance rates. The northern suburbs very strong in Melbourne, were strong last year, northeast, and the west on high volumes also had a clearance rate over 70%. But I think the interesting thing in Melbourne last weekend was a better result from the inner eastern suburbs. Now, the inner east was in pause mode last year, was a boom market in 2015 and 16, but certainly went sideways last year and was typically the lowest performer on a week-by-week basis. But better results for the inner east on the weekend, but we're looking for more auctions to get a real feel whether that prestige market is up and running in Melbourne. And of course, Melbourne will have around about 750 auctions next weekend, so the tests keep coming, and it looks like sellers are still pretty confident in that Melbourne market at the moment.
Yeah, no, we touched on it before. We might just have another look at that, the Sydney listings as well, in terms of where the auction clearances were over the weekend. What are we seeing a trend with in Sydney in terms of where the property is moving the most?
Well, look, a higher proportion of inner suburban, higher price suburbs at the weekend. I think that helped to lift clearance rates. The northern beaches and the inner west were the top performers, and that's a trend that we saw last year. But I thought a very interesting result from Sydney at the weekend was the western suburbs. Now, the western suburbs have been clearly dragging the chain, those lower price suburbs that had the boom 2 or 3 years ago, a lot of investor activity there. They've really been moving sideways. That western suburban market's been moving sideways for most of the last year, but certainly on Saturday with a clearance rate over 80%. Some good early signs there for those outer suburban markets, and perhaps it's first home buyers getting into those, I guess, more affordable suburbs, if there's such a thing, in the outer regions of Sydney.
Yeah, well, let's talk about first home buyers.
Yes.
So we're starting to see them come back now, aren't we?
Well, no surprise, of course. We've had significant changes to stamp duty for first home buyers in Victoria and New South Wales. That came into effect last July. Of course, no stamp duty for purchases up to $600,000 in Victoria, and no stamp duty up to $650,000 in New South Wales. Now, you know, a lot of that pent-up demand has moved into the marketplace, and we've seen a big rise in the New South Wales market, particularly, of course, an increase year on year of 33% in the number of first home buyers, which is great news. It's a great Australian dream being realised for thousands of more first home buyers in New South Wales. And look, most other states also showed increases. Queensland was supported by the first home buyer boost, the first home buyer grant boost, which was extended to the end of last year, and that helped to keep first home buyer numbers ticking over in Queensland. But I think the really interesting stat is if we look at the market share for first home buyers, even though we've seen this remarkable increase last year, and predictable increase I guess as well, first home buyer market share, that is the share of first home buyers for total residential lending, is still well below average in Victoria, and well below average still in New South Wales. So there's still a lot of hard yards to go before we get anywhere near those long-term averages, particularly in New South Wales for first home buyers. And it really is a concern, because I guess the aspiration for home ownership still remains very strong, I think, for most Australians, but it's certainly becoming almost mission impossible over the longer term, particularly in New South Wales.
So those sort of stimulus measures that various state governments take out, they don't necessarily have a lasting effect, do they? Do the things sort of find their level after a brief period?
They're good news. If we're getting thousands of more first home buyers into the marketplace, that's a good news story, and ticks to state governments for doing that. But at the end of the day, with fixed supply and increased demand, you're only going to get higher prices. And the point is that if prices rise by that actual benefit that's been given to first home buyers, then the first home buyers that are coming in behind have to pay higher prices. And with incomes growth flat and rents rising, it becomes a challenge for those in the queue that haven't taken advantage of that short-term hit with those stamp duty benefits. So, but I think, and because of that, we will see the numbers of first home buyers that were very strong in the second half of last year start to wane as the year progresses this year. But certainly good news for first home buyers getting into the market. But I do firmly believe that more supply is the long-term answer for realising that great Australian dream.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, we've got a graph looking at the size of loans as well.
Well, no surprise that that New South Wales has the highest average loan. That was over December. You can see those average loan size reflect the median house price in those capital city markets. And remember, this is just the loan, which is typically 80 to 90% of the value of the property. So if we extrapolate that, we're looking at certainly higher figures than the loan figures. But just on a 20% deposit there, you can see the typical first home buyer in New South Wales would be paying around $500,000 for their property, and there's not a lot of choice for properties at $500,000 in the Sydney market. So I think you'll find that a lot of first home buyers in New South Wales were purchasing regional properties, which were obviously more affordable. But look, it's still a big challenge in the Sydney market for first home buyers, but all ticks to the government for promoting or for getting, releasing all that pent-up demand for first home buyers, but it's still very skinny in terms of the historical numbers that we've had in the market.
Yeah, and given how much the gap widens at the top end of the market, state to state, it's interesting to see how close it is at the lower end of the market. Well,
it is interesting, and that's obviously determined that incomes aren't that much different for first home buyers from state to state. So it's only really the entry price level that governs the loans that people can take. And, because in other capital city markets, you can see that it's the trade-in, the trade-in that people come as owner-occupiers that give them the capacity to push up prices. But first home buyers don't have a trade-in. They're entering the market just on the basis of their saved deposits. That's why most of them will, take an 80 or 90% loan to get into the market as quickly as they can. But no, there's not a lot of difference between the loans that are taken out in each capital city market. And as I said, that's governed by really the fact that the incomes in each of those markets, each of those economies, local state economies, are quite similar for first home buyers.
Now, Chinese New Year,
yes.
Is that likely to have much of an impact, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, in terms of what's purchased in the next couple of weeks?
Well, perhaps not. I think that, the Chinese buyer, Australian Chinese buyer and international Chinese buyers are reasonably circumspect about property. They've, Chinese, have a very similar, I guess, attitude towards property investment, particularly residential investment. They understand that sort of bricks and mortar, safe as houses dynamic. We had a lot of chat last year about a fade out in the attraction of Australian property for Chinese buyers for various reasons, but really there's no sign for that. And we've got to understand it's not just a financial issue that attracts Chinese buyers to Australian real estate, Australian residential real estate. It's also those cultural connections. We have very strong Chinese communities in Melbourne and Sydney. I mean, they're all here to stay, and you know, we have a very strong student population as well, and a very strong student industry that attracts Chinese into Australia and over the longer term as migrants. And I think that will keep demand for Australian residential property, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, from Chinese ticking over. So I'm sure they'll be thinking about buying some more real estate during the celebrations for New Year.
There is typically a bit of a buying frenzy, though, isn't there, from Chinese nationals who are around in the capital cities?
Well, I think that there is, and you know, it is a part of that you know, very strong connection to residential real estate that Chinese do have, and I think they understand that Australian real estate markets, by and large, are solid and resilient and robust. And part of that is that mindset, that sense of security in bricks and mortar investment. And as I said, we've got very strong Chinese communities, particularly in Melbourne, where we have some, you know, strong enclaves out to the east, which are, you know, very much attracted to Chinese buyers. And you know, that's a very positive thing in terms of keeping our housing markets balanced through the, I guess, the ups and downs of confidence and the ups and downs of economic activity. But look, I think we'll find that there's been no real significant shift, if any shift, in Chinese demand for Australian real estate this year compared to previous years.
So this time next week, do you think we will have seen a slightly higher clearance rates across the country? Well,
look, I think the signs are that the Melbourne market is again emerging as the strongest market in the country. I think that market looks quietly confident to me. Sellers' numbers are up. Clearance rates are looking, even though they're lower than a year ago, are looking to hold. Of course, we don't have that lower interest rate driver we had a year ago. That's washed its way through the system. I think other markets are looking a little fragile. Still Sydney, but look, Sydney is I think, still going to be, by and large, a better market if you're a seller than a buyer. But it's interesting that we did see some better results from the outer suburbs of Sydney on the weekend. But of course, this is something that will unfold over the next month as we certainly get higher numbers of listings. But make no mistake, those low listing numbers do reflect confidence from sellers, which seems to be a little fragile at the moment in Sydney particularly.